Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, January 30th edition of the Cluster API office hours. We have a relatively light agenda today, so if you have any topics, please go ahead and add them. The doc is linked in the chat. To start with, it looks like we have an announcement that the dependencies for Cluster API have been updated to 113. That was done thanks to Vince. Is there anything you want to add there, Vince?
No, that's pretty much it.
All right. If nobody has any questions, comments, concerns about that, we can go ahead and move on. Next topic is a proposal to split cluster API. I believe this is you, Vince.
Yeah, so this is me and Robert. Unfortunately, he cannot attend. So the proposal that we put up last week, I believe, was to split the cluster API as of right now into multiple API groups. So if you have kind of like more feedback on the proposal, please put it in the document. I've heard some folks like kind of discussing what multiple API groups means, like the repercussion of those. I think, and I'll kind of chat with Robert around this later, but I think like we kind of want to reword this as mostly like this is the goal where we want to be, and leave the discussion and implementation details on how we want to get there after V1 Alpha 1 gets delivered. But if the kind of like the concepts and like the goal of like pretty much having different types of inference responsibility are clear, then we can move forward into some of the topics that are like up for discussion right now. One of them is how to run multiple clusters in the same namespace, and this will clear the road for that. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask or leave comments on the proposal. I will reword some things later this afternoon after I talk to Robert.
All right. Thank you, Vince.
I have a question about that. I saw one of the first comments on the doc was recently Tim said, are we trying to do this before we went Alpha 1? Is what I'm hearing you say that we're not going to attempt this change before we went Alpha 1?
I think that's a very broad change. I mean, like we will introduce like 2 more API groups at this point. And the providers will also all need to change. So given that we said V1 Alpha 1 for, I believe like we have 2 months, that's kind of a stretch given the backlog that we have right now. But I do think that like after we agree, like where we want to be in V1 Alpha 2 maybe, we can get some work done in V1 Alpha 1 to solve like some issues that are open right now to get there later, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Yep. All right. Next item on the agenda is Vikas extending the machine status to add provider ID field.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. This is a very small PR, and it was pending since long time. And I think in the last meeting it was discussed, and finally we agreed to add this provider ID field in the machine in the spec of the machine object. So I think Vince left a comment there to add more description over the field. So it's just an update from my side. I have added more details in the use case over that field, and also I'm going through Doku process and David's PR how to add documentation in the Git book for this. So that I'll be doing before the next meeting. So that was the update from my side.
All right. Any additional questions for Vikas?
I think the PR is good to go. If Jason, you want to give a look later, I think you have some comments, right? I'm okay approving this and leaving the look LGTM to one of you.
Thanks.
Sounds good. Yeah. I can definitely take a look at that later today. All right. If there's nothing else there, it looks like Ilya has the next topic, discussing broad architecture and API style ideas.
Yeah, so I think this is related to the splitting up the API, and a few thoughts that I had, and I thought I'd share them while we're discussing this potential split, which could be a big change, and whether there are any other things we may consider. So I've previously drafted some ideas and kept them as a draft, and haven't quite got around to sharing it yet. But I figured maybe now is a good time to kind of have a bit more of a discussion around it. So I did actually prepare a couple of slides here. So let me share the screen. Yeah, so share screen. Okay, so yeah, can you see these slides?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, we sure can.
Yeah, so what is generic layer 4 versus a provider specific layer, right? So I think it should answer some simple questions very easily. For example, if you walk up to a management cluster that manages some set of clusters, you should be able to easily figure out how many clusters do you have there, how many nodes are in each of those clusters, and what the versions are, and how to connect to any particular cluster. It seems like a simple set of questions to begin with, right? So in terms of what are the common fields between different providers, in absolute sense, I believe there are really no absolutely common fields which would be required in all the providers, right? It's really hard to define, and we've been trying to do that. And I just looked at the spec, and it looks like pod CIDR and service CIDR are actually required parameters currently. And in my particular case with EKS control, I couldn't actually make good use of those. There are other sort of CIDRs that users care about, but those are not exactly pod CIDRs. Anyway, we can get to specifics later, but that was one example, right? And cluster DNS is one other required parameter, which is pretty odd, I think. So I think all there is in common is just the metadata. So there's a notion of some clusters and their names, basically, and potentially how to connect to them, API endpoints, CA certs, and maybe the status, whether the cluster is ready or still creating, something like that. Well, essentially, I'm thinking that it'd be reasonable to consider whether we have any common fields at all, other than a metadata. What does the user care about? Well, they care about ease of use, a meaningful API, and reliable declarative behavior. So when they look at an API, it should speak to them. When I started looking at some of the providers out there, I've looked at a few of them, and the API didn't speak to me. There is some cluster object that has a bunch of CIDRs defined in it, and then there's some nodes that happen to represent masters, and then also actual workers. And I can really kind of picture the whole thing very easily. They're pretty verbose objects. My main concerns with the current approach is that it's not, as an implementer, it's not very clear what's the path for the common component, how I'm supposed to look at the common components. I mean, essentially, the last point on this slide is that the product of the common repo, the cluster API repo, isn't exactly a library, neither it's a deployable component. As far as I could tell, I couldn't see there are bits that I could use as a library or a deployable component. And I felt like basically trying to rely on that and figure out how I can use the common repo, the code in the common repo, seemed kind of fruitless, actually. And if you take a look at EKS control, you'll see we basically did it all from scratch in rather short period of time for what we wanted, especially just to create cluster functionality. And the rest, we have other challenges to deal with, and those are not something that cluster API repo would help us with. And in a way, you could think EKS control could have been a fork of cluster control, but I'm not entirely sure what would that bring exactly. It's not that hard to create a CLI in Go. So yeah, and then some common fields are not applicable to all providers, as I said earlier. And there's no common CLI that is actually useful to the end users. So it's not exactly clear what are the common components for, really. So what is being suggested? So I think these would be reasonable goals to consider. So we should try to define how common components relate to provider implementations, create a common CLI, and make common API do a simple and meaningful thing. It's not supposed to do magic. It should be meaningful enough, perhaps answering the 3 questions that have been outlined on the first slide would be a helpful thing to do. And make a product of the common repo something that is a bit more sensible to a consumer. Is it a daemon controller type thing that I could deploy as a pod, or is it like a library I call out to? So, you know, answering those questions would be pretty good, I think. So in terms of architecture, the kind of thing that I had in mind is something where, oh dear, fat fingers. There's a cluster that runs cluster API controller of some sort, potentially, and a provider-specific controller comes in and registers with the cluster API controller. And there is something useful that cluster API controller provides to the provider that simplifies provider implementation or does something else. And the controller, this generic controller, maintains a set of objects that contain metadata about provider-specific objects. So when a user goes to create a cluster, they define a provider-specific object and create that, and then, you know, provider does what it does, and then eventually it reports back to the generic layer and tells it, hey, we have a cluster, it's called this, and here's its status and stuff, right? So the idea is that, you know, here's an example. Basically, a provider comes in and says, okay, well, I'm called this thing, EKS control D, for example, and I have these 2 kinds that I care about. And please keep track of those for me. And basically, that's all it does. And then a user goes and says, okay, I want an EKS cluster. I'm going to define that and say that I want it in this region, and I need like 1 node group in there, and then I define the node group, and basically 10 nodes, and it has instance type parameter. Everything else user wishes to keep as default, whatever the defaults are for the given provider. And then in the generic layer, if they walked up to the cluster and did like kubectl get clusters, they could see an object that represents that cluster they've just defined. And this references the actual provider-specific definition, and it has the status fields. And they could potentially use that, perhaps via some tool to kind of create a kubeconfig file or something like that. And then they'll be able to go and look up what the actual object is and what does it say about itself. And you know, similarly for the node group, it would map to the common ID of a node set, and similar type of information would be available for it. Note that there isn't even a scale parameter to this or anything, because scale parameter is not like a single thing. In AWS, you actually have, you know, the minimum, the maximum, and desired capacity. So, you know, I'm not entirely sure how to represent those as a scale parameter in the same definition you have scale or replication controller. And you know, here's another example, completely different style provider, one that is called bare metal. Unfortunately, I pasted the wrong image here. But here's the actual object of a cluster in bare metal that happens to have this set of fields, much more specific about networking setup and you know, stuff around DHCP and DNS and has some feature called seal SSH that's specific to this provider. Basically, it just disables SSH after it's done installing all the Kubernetes components or whatever that it has to do, and it happens to have cluster DNS and that. And then there is a specific type definition for the kind of node that this provider can manage. So it has like a pool of machines which it keeps, and it has, for example, a whole rack, and it can hand them out to any cluster that user requests. So user goes and creates a bare metal pool node, and they get it fairly quickly, much quicker than some other type of node that this provider may have that may require manual steps or something like that. So yeah, so that's kind of the idea. And then obviously there's a generic definition which is very much the same like what we said earlier. So these are the ideas that I had in mind that that may help us, and I want to put what you folks think. I have a more detailed draft, but yeah, I haven't quite finished that yet. It's got some typos and needs some more work.
So I think there's a lot of overlapping issues and concerns. I don't agree with all the suppositions you made. I mean, some of which are valid. Some I disagree with. But I think rallying on a post V1 Alpha 1 world to see the shape of the APIs that we want is totally legitimate.
Sorry.
And we should probably start, as Vince has started to create a spec and for how we want to potentially break up the APIs or what shape the API should be in. We might even want to entertain the idea of reformulating separate APIs as well. I think working together as a group on a separate, what are the next step in a post V1 Alpha 1 world seems totally fine and valid. But I think we should also make sure that we honestly vet the suppositions being made as well.
Sure. I mean, I was like, I was hoping to use Cluster API, the product of Cluster API repo in EKS control, and I figured, well, it's easier to go and roll a thing of my own. It took me really, very little time to actually do the first pass at it. Other things are details of the particular provider, the bugs we happen to have of our own. So yeah, so the kind of thinking here is that, trying to basically provide some feedback and what ideas crossed my mind after I spent some time thinking about it. And definitely happy to collaborate more on this. And I'm glad to see there's some movement towards, shuffling things around, reworking different concepts and things. It's very definitely good to see. So yeah.
I will be interested. When you shared this idea this afternoon in the open office hours, I really like it. I mean, I think that it's a natural way to implement this idea of having a controller which is generic and an actuator which is specific, and instead of passing some opaque object to pass something which is defined by the provider. And that I really like the concept. Unfortunately, what I don't know right now is to what extent that will break the existing API. I think that's the main concern that probably we should consider. But if you want to move forward, the idea can help you to shape the proposal and the draft or whatever. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, so one more thing I kind of wanted to add, the kind of high-level thinking is that at the moment, the style of object that we have, it tries to be a union, essentially, and it isn't quite. I'm not entirely sure what's the status of using multiple providers in a single cluster. I haven't been able to confirm that, but it seems like, it could work, but there are some glitches there. It seems like, but maybe I'm wrong.
You're right. I think what I've heard on that is that we think it might work. We think it will lead to copious errors or warning messages in the logs, or whichever controller can't decode the provider spec. So,
well, we were going to have the conversation piece was to have a field, a well-defined field, which is basically a string that allows it to individual controllers to determine whether or not they need to decode the provider config.
Sure, I just mean right now we think it doesn't work cleanly, at least.
Yeah.
So I agree there's work necessary.
One thing that I want to add to the slides that you shared, like I think it would be like great because there were like a few points that you made to like put those into issues, like kind of distill this a little bit so that we can sync the issues offline and people can chime in into a more like, like discussion, like where we want to go forward. Not like, I mean, you could do like as high level as you want, but you brought up like a very good point, like in use cases, which I think it would be great to track.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in the EKS use case. There are a number of important issues you brought up in terms of the API should speak to you. So there's certain areas right now where, for instance, the master is implied by the existence of a field, and that's an example of where the API is not speaking to you, right? It requires you to come to the system with a priori knowledge to understand what the existence or absence of a field means for the controllers. There's so many issues here that I don't think we can go into all of them. I think separate tickets might help make it easier to talk about each issue. But I wanted to ask one specific thing because we're interested in EKS at Samsung. Did you consider using the machine set actuator?
No, because we've started with code that existed in the CLI that drove CloudFormation, and it did it in a particular way that we were quite happy with. And I think it may be possible to just throw machine set actuator in potentially. It's just that we have a few existing use cases that we support, and managing everything through CloudFormation and relying on the remote state to be managed by CloudFormation seemed like a good idea, so that we don't actually have to have a daemon, right? So it's like, I mean, in fact, it's all kind of about, to start with, we wanted what Cluster API doesn't cater for at the moment, being able to create clusters just based on the config file with a CLI without adding more to it, without having to have a controller in another cluster type thing. Right, so we kind of wanted to take the existing functionality of the CLI that we had that basically drives CloudFormation and add config file support to that, and then extend into a daemon controller. But more of the EKS control users really needed the config file support, not so much a controller that manages multiple clusters. They just want to create a cluster from a config file and check that config file in, and then update it later. So yeah.
I think that makes sense. So then I just have one comment, and that's that I think you're right that we could make the API easier to understand and read both for humans and computers. One concern I have is in particular, so EKS is something that I think is a good example to vet out these ideas because it's very different. Things like Vince's control plane resource suggestion, that might be one way to handle EKS. Overriding the machine set actuator or creating a machine set actuator would be another. And then there's a few other ideas. But I think it's important that we use upstream resource types for this and not ad hoc provider specific ones, because otherwise integrations with the cluster autoscaler won't work. So that's, I guess, my only feedback is that I understand the desire to create your own objects, and it does certainly make it easier. But to the extent that it diverges from upstream top-level objects, it makes it harder to build higher-level functionality. And that's something I've been concerned about with the project since the beginning. Is I think a lot of the value comes from having shared tooling on top of the cluster API. And to the extent that we can't agree on common semantics, it just makes it harder to build or impossible to build higher-level tooling.
Sure.
Sorry, but I think my understanding, Ilya, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding that basically what you're proposing is that this spec, which is now embedded into the generic object, put it moving away and making a reference. So basically, whatever is common should remain common, and whatever high-level tools nowadays we should only use the common parts. So moving this spec as an individual object, that for me make a lot more sense, because I can create tools or actuator or operators that act on this object without having to go to the heuristic object and extract this part. But I mean, that's my understanding. I mean, you're basically taking out this spec as an individual object, which is provider specific, right?
Yeah, so exactly, yeah. So I mean, what I was thinking is that, you know, currently we do have our own top level object in EKS control, and the idea was to just create that for experience, and that's like Alpha 3 happens to be. We kind of virtually skipped our Alpha 1 and Alpha 2 in a way. So yeah, and that object, you know, could basically fit into the envelope of cluster APIs it's currently defined. It'd be just the provider spec. But like, you know, what's the user benefit of using that envelope? I'm not entirely sure. They just need to type a lot of things before they can use the thing, and then you know, whenever they copy it to create a new slightly different object, they have to copy all that boilerplate along, and it's not entirely clear what's the benefit of it at the moment. So I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how we arrive at a point where there is more benefit to everybody of using the common tooling, and there's a clear path to how that evolves and benefits everyone. So right now, for me was kind of hard to extract the benefit from looking at all the different provider implementations, and I wasn't sure why. So like, well, I mean, I just need the config file support. All the other implementations require a cluster to start with, like Minikube or whatever, and I mean, that seems inconvenient. So, you know, and then what I'm trying to say is that definitely want to collaborate more, and I don't want to fork these things. And if we're talking about cluster API, it should be what everybody agrees on, and not, you know, a bunch of different things. So I'm just wondering, right now we kind of have some common fields and some metadata and some bits that are nested within that sort of common envelope. But I wonder what people think about the shape going forward, because I mean, at the moment, I do see the proposal that is being put forward. I think that's very good. And I think this is a bit related, just a slightly alternative idea, and you know.
So I think a point of order of, like, you know, we can bike shit on the details here, but I think a point of order that we should probably do is similar to akin to what the upstream semantics are. One of the problems that I faced with cluster API in general is that we keep on pushing the goalposts. And what I want to avoid is yet another goalpost push. Right?
Oh, sure.
So what I think makes a ton of sense, and what we do in upstream everything else, right, is you go through a proposal cycle, right? So after we get V1 Alpha 1 out the door, go through a standard proposal cycle. In, you know, in true Athenian democracy, which is like open source everything, we make the case, you write the proposal, we vote on what we consider the best, and we go forth and we make that happen.
Yeah, sounds good.
I think that makes a ton of sense from a Administrivia perspective, and we can do that. But I don't want to, like, one thing I don't want to do too is I don't want for us to introspect to the point where we fail to deliver V1 Alpha 1 in perpetuity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely agree. Yeah, I'm just sort of, what I gathered, there was discussion going on about potentially major changes to the API structure. So I was going to forward some of the ideas that I've been sitting on for a while, and see what people think, and whether I should keep working on any of that, or, you know, think of something else or whatever. So this is good to hear. It sounds like there are a few things that we'll need to discuss in more detail, but definitely I understand the V1 Alpha 1 priority there. Yeah.
Yeah, and not to cut this discussion any shorter, but we do have a few more items on the agenda, so we should really move on. So next item is from Daniel. You're bringing up a PR.
Yeah, thanks. MySim filed this. It'd be great if people would take a look. I think a few people already have. The idea is to remove the Kubernetes specific fields from the machine object. I'm not sure this might be implied by the splitting of the machines API from the cluster API. Vince, is that true? Is that implied? Like the fields with the Kubernetes specific fields would be removed?
Not the versioning field. We haven't talked about that. So I know that you left a comment, like I read your comment in the PR. I was gonna challenge this a little bit and say, like, is this out of scope for this first 2 iteration of cluster? Because I understand like some people wanna like use cluster API to manage any cluster. The question for the group is, do we feel this is out of scope, or what benefit does it bring to, if the goal of cluster API is to run Kubernetes or like make run Kubernetes cluster easy?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I left a comment in the PR, and the high level summary is that I think there's an issue with the way that the actuator today does both the machine and the software provisioning, and it can be useful to separate those two. And if you do separate the two, then the machine object might be the appropriate object for doing the machine provisioning, and a separate object might be the appropriate thing for doing the software provisioning. So I think there are separate motivations. Like one, I think that Meisen brings up is, hey, use the machines API to bring up non-Kubernetes nodes. But another motivation is, to allow separating the machine provisioning from the software provisioning, which is a step to having a common software provisioning piece that multiple providers can use. Because I think to date, most providers are re-implementing the same software provisioning pattern, with calling kubeadm or installing various dependencies, and it could be useful to have that common. But there are other ways to do that. So just wanted to bring this up, get eyeballs on it, and that's it. Thanks.
Yep. So moving on, next item is Tim for triage and V1 Alpha 1 state.
So as part of the ongoing effort that we spent a couple of weeks ago now, we had walked through the entire backlog and did a grooming session. We should probably do that today as well, just to see if there's any major status updates for V1 Alpha 1, as well as whether or not there's any inbound issues that need to be triaged. It looks like there's a couple. I will try and share my screen here. Hopefully folks can see my screen. Yes, no?
Yes.
Great. Document bootstrap flags. I would assume that you would want to hit that for V1 Alpha 1. Chuck?
Yeah, I tried to set the milestone, but I don't think I have milestone capabilities.
Yeah, there's a separate section for milestone maintainer. What we can do too as well is, let's talk offline. If folks want to have milestone capabilities, let's talk with Aaron and get that settled. There's a couple of finagly issues. Let's see if you did this for this one too.
I think this is actually a dupe, or there's a PR already open for it. Yeah, Vince linked to it. So this one's actually active, I would say.
Who is working on that PR? Should we just, hold on 1 second here. Do I have edit rights? What's the number? Fixes 719. All right, hopefully GitHub should do its business and we won't have to deal with it. Machine stateful set for HA control plane.
I also tried to set the milestone, but nope.
All right, let's get that fixed so that way when folks do the triaging, we don't have to do this again. I'll talk with Aaron again, as I mentioned. Disassociating machines from Kubernetes. That's kind of funky.
This is the issue we just talked about previously.
It's the same as this? No.
No. It's the one that Daniel brought up previously in the agenda.
Oh, okay. It sounds like next. Is that fair?
I believe so.
Go ahead, Daniel. I don't want to. What do you think?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, no. This is just an issue to for people to leave comments. I think that MySim file. It's not not anything for V1 Alpha 1.
Okay, sounds good. Is there any other status update that folks wanted to give for everyone else working on V1 Alpha 1? Current burn down is 22 open items.
Can you remove revisit actuators? It was up from this milestone, given the discussion that we just had. And then later, if you go to 41.
Wait a second here. You want me to move this out to next first?
Yeah.
All right. And you want me to look at issue number 41?
41, yeah. It's already in this milestone.
Okay.
So for this, so I was thinking like to just like fix this as of right now, given like the proposal that's out and discussion that's for later, and how do we improve like the current status of the actuators. One way to solve this issue is to pretty much just like add a field selector, sorry, a label into the machine to link them to a cluster, and this will solve also the problem of having multiple clusters per namespace. I think that's a good short gap for now, and if folks have any concern, please add them to the issue or the PR for later.
Okay. Is there any other update that folks want to give on V1 Alpha 1? Or once, twice, 3 times. All right, my screen share is done.
All right. Any other topics? Going once, going twice. All right. Everybody have a great day. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.